Broadcasting live from somewhere underneath the ground. Archaeology News. The news you can trust.
All right, the first story in today's Archaeology News is actually very timely because we just did a whole talk about the Neanderthals and the ABCs of archaeology, and a big part of that was what actually happened to them. How did they disappear? Well, there's a new study that came out that sort of takes a different approach to that question. Rather than looking at the impact of Neanderthal DNA in modern humans, these researchers looked at the impact of modern humans in Neanderthal DNA, so sort of the reverse. Now, how did they do this? Well, according to the paper, there have been just 3 high-quality Neanderthal genomes that have been fully sequenced. Now, one of these comes from Croatia, in a place called Vindia Cave. So that's not the same as Krapina, which we talked about last week and I visited, but not too far away. The other 2 were from Russia, and one of these was from the Denisova cave, and that's pretty exciting because Denisova is a cave all the way in the Altai Mountains, which has now come up a number of times, and that was where a species of early hominins called the Denisovans was sort of identified. That's the type site. Now, the Denisovans are known from only a couple of bones, but they seem to be very related to the Neanderthals. And their existence was only confirmed in 2010 when there was a mitochondrial DNA test done of some of the bones that identified it as a specific species. Anyway, this paper gets really technical, so I'm going to break it down very simply. So to start, humans and Neanderthals are quite closely related, but definitely 2 given humans have much more in common genetically than 2 given Neanderthals. So that should be pretty obvious. When a man and a woman come together to make a baby, they each contribute their genetic material. So every person has 2 copies of each gene. Hence, the product of a human-Neanderthal union would be much more likely to have 2 different versions of a gene, known as heterozygosity, than would the child of, let's say, just 2 humans or 2 Neanderthals. Those would be more likely to have the same version of each gene. Starting from this logic, the team compared these 3 high-quality Neanderthal genomes with those of 2,000 modern humans, and they compared the level of heterozygosity among the 2 populations and used statistics to infer the level of interbreeding. And what they found was that modern humans contributed between 2.5 to 3.7 of the Neanderthal genome. Put differently, 1 out of every 30 Neanderthal parents was actually a modern human being. Moreover, they found a surprising lack of genetic variation in those Neanderthal genomes, which led them to estimate an average population of the Neanderthals about 20% smaller than previous estimates. Now, this is very important because if you recall, there were not a lot of Neanderthals at any given time. Their numbers were in thousands or, low tens of thousands, not millions. So that left them very spread out, thinly populated, and vulnerable, both physically and genetically. And finally, looking into the pairing of specific genes, the team estimated 2 periods of genetic intermingling between modern humans and Neanderthals. Remember, they actually coexisted in time, if not always in space, for hundreds of thousands of years. So one of these periods of genetic intermingling was between 100 and 120,000 years ago, the other 200 to 250,000 years ago, though this definitely doesn't preclude individual relationships that didn't leave much of an impact on the gene pool.
Hey, you know what I think we should do tonight?
What?
I think we should get some people together, huh? My friends and your friends. We could go out and get some drinks or something.
Actually, tonight's not a very good night. I already have plans. It's kind of a girls' night.
And it's not surprising that there were only a few periods of intermingling found, because remember, the world at this time was very, very sparsely populated, and people and Neanderthals were hunter-gatherers, so they were doing a lot of moving around. So putting it all together, the not infrequent interbreeding, lack of genetic diversity, and small population of Neanderthals suggests that they very well may have just been bred out of existence. They were just absorbed by the modern human population. However, if you ask me, this is actually quite tenuous. One of those examples I think of researchers getting ahead of their skis. I've seen so many examples of very small sample ADNA studies jumping to conclusions and going seriously wrong, sometimes actually with modern-day consequences. In fact, there's an unpublished paper making the rounds now that says something pretty different. It looks at the other perspective at humans from the Paleolithic times till about 2,000 years ago, examining genomes. And what it found, what their findings suggested, was a period of interbreeding between human beings and Neanderthals, starting about 47,000 years ago and lasting about 7,000 years. That was more in line with previous research, which suggested, I believe, periods of interbreeding like 50 and 60,000 years ago. But to the layperson, the non-expert like me, having seen this movie before, this just sounds all very early stage and tenuous at this point. We need a lot more genomes and perhaps some better techniques before we really figure this one out. Trust me, having seen this movie before with ADNA, we gotta be careful. So, stay tuned. I like this next story because it goes to show you that not everything old has some esoteric or ritualistic meaning. Sometimes impressive old things have relatively mundane explanations. So we're going to go off to Saudi Arabia, to the ancient city of Alula in the northwestern corner of the country. Now, it seems like a lot of interesting archaeology is coming out of Saudi Arabia recently. We've studied a few stories on this channel already, and I think that's just part of the country generally opening up more these days to travelers and scholars. All right, so in a plateau around the city of Alula, which is actually a volcanic plateau, researchers found more than 300 stone circles, some of them clustered together, and many with paved surfaces in and around them, like floors. They exhibit a high degree of uniformity in their structure, though the height of the stones does vary quite a bit, from 4 to 8 meters. That's 13 to 26 feet. So I know what you're probably thinking, because so was I. Stone circles, Stonehenge, Druids, ritual. Well, actually not so much. First, with so many of these relatively architecturally simple stone circles, it's hard to really imagine that they were special. Now, of course, there were actually a few of those concentric stone circles, those Stonehenge-like ones found in the area, 3 to be exact. And those very well may have been ritual places. But you know what? There are examples of those scattered around the Middle East. It's these hundreds of relatively simple, relatively uniform ones which are the new thing. Helpfully, there were plenty of finds. So there were lots of stone tools and flakes that had been worked. There was charcoal, there was lots of animal bone, and there were some exotic things like seashells or stone that had been worked into pendants and ornamental things. However, 2 of those things should have jumped out at you, and that would be bone and charcoal, because those are organic, so they can be radiocarbon dated. And that's just what the team did with 44 samples. And they came back with 2 clusters of dates. One, 5900 to 5100 BC. The other, 4700 to 4300 BC. So these would have been 2 periods of intense use or occupation. Now that is 6,000 to 8,000 years old. And it's important to recognize how, well, domestic this all seems. Stone tools, lots of butchered animals that you've eaten, hearths where you've cooked them, a few precious keepsakes that you're storing away. These look like houses. And in testing out some of the stone tools, experimental archaeology, they seem to be very good for woodworking. So it's hypothesized that these stone walls and standing stones had some wooden structures in and around them, perhaps even roofs. And while local conditions make reconstructing what the environment was like at that time, how hospitable it was, the fact that these dwellings are so permanent and required so much labor to build suggests that these are not sort of stopping off points for semi-nomadic people, but in fact permanent dwellings, McMansions of the distant, distant past.
Barbie Dream House! Barbie's ultimate dream house! The slimes! So many rooms, so much to do!
What we think we found here is the beginning of the Neolithic in this region. More permanent dwellings appropriate for a more sedentary lifestyle. No more roaming around with the animals. And the final story concerns some new cave art found in Venezuela, and this looks quite different from the stuff we've seen before. Now, we're going to go all the way to a remote southeastern part of the country called the Canaima National Park. And this is actually where you'll find Angel Falls, the tallest uninterrupted waterfall in the world, at 1 kilometer tall, or 3/5 of a mile. And there you will find a flattened table-like mountain called Upuigma Tepuy. Tepuy is a flat mountain, where recently 20 cave art sites were discovered. They're located on a boulder which is very prominent in the landscape and actually provides some shelter in caves. Now, the paintings are quite unique because they're made with a red ochre that was probably found in a ferrous mineral anomaly, which is located within 1 kilometer of the site. The images are made up of dots and sort of strange geometric forms, some of them resembling maze-like structures, others some perhaps human-like figures. Now, these images are digitally enhanced, but overall, the works of art are pretty well preserved. Yeah, it's pretty difficult to tell what's going on here, but again, there are some things that seem to be human-like forms, and this image here is pretty clearly a leaf. Dating these images would probably entail radiocarbon dating of the mineral accretions that have formed over the paintings themselves. Now, that hasn't been done yet, but some paintings in the general area have been as old as 5,000 years. Stylistically, they resemble some images the team found nearby, so late, in fact, that they didn't quite make it into this paper and will be forthcoming in a new publication. However, they're not exactly the same as those, so that's kind of difficult to interpret. It could be a different people who learned from one another. It could be the same people but later in time, or it could just be different artists taking creative license. What I really do like about this paper, though, is that it's really humble. They don't try to overinterpret their findings to make some splashy headlines. Their really only conjecture is that, given that these were in such a prominent place in the landscape, the paintings were made where there was shelter, they may have figured in some kind of ritual activity. And there's that word again, ritual. You can take a drink. Anyway, based on the cave walls and ceilings blackened by smoke, they can tell people stuck around here for quite a while. So there is research ongoing on the site, and of course there's those other nearby sites. So we're going to be hearing more about this. Watch this space. Hey, if you like what you heard, give me that thumbs up below, hit that bell to subscribe, or if you want to support more independent archaeology content, consider contributing to my Patreon, where you can enjoy some exclusive members-only benefits and other goodies. Until the next dig.